My experience with SMPs. So I'll make a bold statement to start the video. I believe that these are the best designed saddles in a general sense in the world. I think they have the best general design metrics that you would want from any saddle of anything that's on the market. They have a number of upsides though and a number of downsides, just like any saddle. The big one that most people have a gripe with is that they tend to be ugly, although I'm not too fussed. And as you can see, the bike behind me, which is actually my bike, has got an SMP on it at the moment, which is one of their full carbon ones with no padding at all. And it's just been covered with a strip of leather so that it's a bit grippier. And I've been using that seat for quite some time and I love it. So SMPs, what I'll do is I'll run you through, first of all, the general kind of idea behind them, and then I'll run you through some of the different models. I've got 5 here, and these are kind of the 5 that I use the most, that I put people on the most commonly used ones, which are the most comfortable for most people. Unfortunately, one of the downsides is they have a massive range. If you ever have a scan through the SMP website, there's like 30 different seats. There's just too many. There's too many and it's unnecessary. But these are the 5 that I find that are the most commonly comfortable for people. Now, SMPs, what's good and what's bad about them? The general shape that I like, the thing that I like about them is the general shape. They are shaped very much like a mirror image of a human pelvis. They curve in 3 dimensions, just like a human pelvis. They have a marked, most of them have a marked rise at the rear, which tends to sit around the curvature of your backside and prevent rearwards slip when you're climbing and that kind of stuff. They have a big, long channel for perineum relief, which is, you know, the standard thing with high quality saddles these days for obvious reasons. But the big thing about them is the anatomical shape. They are curved like a human pelvis. They tend to spread, if you can find the right one for your pelvis, they tend to spread pressure over a very large surface area everywhere on the bottom instead of focalizing it in one particular spot. And therefore, they're really comfortable. They tend to hold you in one position much better than most other saddles do because of the pronounced dip as viewed from the side. This Draken here is one of the most curved SMPs that you'll see, apart from maybe a Dynamic, which is, I believe it's a Draken with less padding. But they have a really pronounced dip. So when you try and move forward or back on them, they hold you. A lot of people like the sensation of being held. They like the feeling that when they're going really hard or they're climbing a hill, their pelvis stays in the same spot because it's seated in this dip and you can't really move fore and aft a lot. Having said that, a small subgroup of people hate that. They like being able to move around on the seat, and that's fine. An SMP is not for those people. So they tend to be shaped very well. They hold you nice and stably. They spread pressure really well. And then the other kind of things that are great about them, the rails are tremendously long. So if you've got particularly long femurs, for example, and you need your saddle back a long way because you've accidentally purchased a bike with a seat tube angle that's a bit steep, an SMP has a huge amount of rearwards and forwards translation available in the rails, so they're very adjustable. They're a bit finicky with angles. If you set them up on the wrong angle, they can be a bit uncomfortable, but the angle adjustment, the fore and aft adjustment is fantastic for difficult to fit clients. So I think they're a really high quality seat too. They're made with proper leather. The foam is very hard when you first get on them, and then after a couple of weeks it tends to soften up and bed in and they become much more comfortable. Like a lot of seats, but particularly so with SMPs, the longer you ride a padded SMP, the more comfortable it becomes generally because the padding does soften up quite a lot. Those are the upsides. They're very robust, the leather's good quality, you know, they're fantastic design, all of that kind of stuff. I'll tell you the downsides now. The downsides are, of course, they don't suit everyone. There is no saddle that is perfect for everyone. So there are certainly people out there where we try them on 5 different SMPs and they hate them all, and that's fine, and then they go and grab something else. That's no problem. Everyone is different. There are some people who won't like the shape. The other downside is cost. They are very expensive, generally speaking. They do, I believe that the company holds a number of tightly held international patents on the shape, so you won't see copies of this style of design as you will potentially see from something like the the Specialized Power Saddle, which has been copied by multiple other manufacturers. It's an excellent seat. It's been copied by multiple other manufacturers, and you can find almost every manufacturer offers a saddle which is very similar to a Specialized Power Saddle, but you don't see anyone with something that's very similar to SMP's, and I think that's because they vigorously defend their intellectual property with the patent of the shape. I've heard that. Someone might tell me differently, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I've heard that's the case. And because they have a monopoly on the shape, and it's an excellent shape, they can charge a fair chunk for them. So they're quite expensive. You'll find them online usually for sort of 390, 380 Australian dollars, and that's quite a lot for a saddle. Having said that, people spend $3,000 on carbon fibre wheels left, right and centre, and bang for your buck, a really good saddle it's not a terrible place to spend money. So they're quite expensive. They're not the lightest saddles around, but for anyone who's not a flyweight, that doesn't matter. You can get them in carbon rail versions and all that sort of stuff to make them lighter, but they're not the lightest saddles around. The upside of not being able to move around is simultaneously a downside for some people, and they're very, very finicky with the angle. This is probably the biggest kind of downside, is a lot of people put them on the bike and they get the two highest points of the saddle level. They sit on it and they go, that's horrible, that feels terrible. The best angle that they operate best on is usually about what I call a 10 to 14 millimeter nose down attitude. So if you put a spirit level across the saddle from the highest point across, you should have about a 10, 12, 14 millimeter gap between the spirit level and this highest point of this rise at the nose of the seat, and that'll give you a pretty good starting point for the angle to set them on. But they're extremely finicky with angles. Once you get them on the right angle, they're fantastic, but a tiny angle change will totally change the feel of the seat. So we'll talk briefly about the different models. I've kind of ranked them in order of heaviest rider down to lightest rider, or biggest padding down to less padding, but there's also difference in the shapes. So the Light 209, who does this thing suit? This generally suits heavier riders up over 75 kilos, got a lot of padding, fairly large, solidly built, broadly built people tend to like these. If you rotate your pelvis forward amazingly well, probably not the seat for you, but if you're a more upright rider, a bigger, heavier set guy, a Light 209 is a good one to choose. The Draken. This is very similar, but with a slightly more pronounced dip, and because it's got less padding, it doesn't taper off as rapidly. It stays flat for longer across the rear and then drops off. And this will generally tend to suit medium-sized people between sort of 70 and 80 kilos who rotate their pelvis forward reasonably well. Not a bad saddle at all. Really, really popular, that one. The Nimba is a slight evolution, I think, of the Draken shape. I think this is so far my favourite SMP ever. It's got a medium amount of padding. It's flatter across, let me just turn that around, it's flatter across the rear before it drops down, so it's got an effectively broader rear section because it doesn't taper off as rapidly. And it's got a flatter front section. It doesn't have as much of a pronounced dip as viewed from the side. These are excellent. A lot of people these are kind of a good saddle for people who rotate their pelvis forward well, who are looking for a seat that allows them sort of performance in that long, low position. A really good seat. This is the old favourite, the Dynamic, and this is actually very similar to the Draken with less padding, right? So lighter weight riders who rotate forwards very well. This is it's got a different shape to the Nimba, but they tend to suit the same style of people. So the difference between these is that most riders will feel less perineum pressure with the Nimba, but some people do prefer the Dynamic. So again, a pretty good seat for a lighter rider who rolls their pelvis forward fairly well. And then there's the Blaster. This thing is particularly narrow. So the Light 209 and the Draken are fairly wide. These are kind of a medium width. The Blaster is one of the narrower ones. It's got a fairly similar shape to the Nimba as viewed from the side, but it's just narrower all round. This is the SMP with padding that I would use, which is a particularly narrow pelvis rider who rotates their pelvis forward quite well. So the Blaster, if you're very narrow, is a good one to look for. So that's my take on SMPs. If you can get over the ugliness of the things, mate, I mean, when your backside's on them, you can't see them anyway. So the appearance of the seat is just not something that I'm concerned with at all. But if you can get over that, they are well worth trying. It is an expensive saddle, but the quality is exceptional, and the general design idea behind them I think is fantastic. Bear in mind, they don't suit everyone. And there is a lot of option anxiety when you look at the SMP website because there are just so many different models. These are my top 5, I guess. If you're gonna pin me down and say, you know, which ones do you give to most people? 98% of people, one of these 5 is gonna suit them the best.